that you can see is a later addition down through the years. But as I said, this sanctuary was constructed in 1827. Actually, I believe the first worship service was probably in early 1828. But originally, that's all that would have been here. And there are some old photographs taken that show that structure just sitting there by itself. There's nothing else in the picture. You don't see any other structure anywhere. Nice across the street. You'll notice 1824, of course we've already talked about that. That's when the church was organized. And then 1904. I doubt that any of you would be able to guess the significance of 1904, but what it is, that would have been the 80th anniversary of the church. And that's when the stained glass windows were obtained and put in. They came from somewhere over in Europe. I've forgotten exactly where. But anyway, that's the significance of that date. Before that, and there's some old photographs that show the church before the stained glass windows were put in, and they were just regular pane windows, and they had the big wooden shutters that you could close over the windows. But all that was changed in 1904. Organization of the church and the construction of the building. Again, what we're in now is the original sanctuary, and it's essentially unchanged. Pretty much everything you see in here is original. Now, these particular pews are not the original pews. I think they are vintage, about the same time as the stained glass windows, early 1900s. I guess the original ones were maybe a little worn out by then, but these have been around a long time. I will say that originally there was a raised pulpit here. If you've ever seen some of the old churches, especially up in the New England area, it was fairly common to have raised pulpits. And it said that when the pastor ascended into the pulpit, he was basically on eye level with the balcony. Now, the balcony was originally, you got to remember the times, the balcony was originally the slave gallery. That's where slaves came to worship. They worshiped in this church with everybody else, but they sat in what today is the balcony. Of course, you see there's a huge pipe organ up there and everything. None of that would have been up there. There was an old pump organ that used to be down here about where the piano is today. And if any of you are wondering about that item over there, does anybody know what that is? Over there in that corner. It's a harpsichord. Harpsichord. Now, it's not a real old one. It was one that a couple of our men many years ago, a kit that they got and built themselves. And the problem with a harpsichord, is they're like pianos. They have to occasionally be tuned. And there are not a lot of harpsichord tuners around, anymore. You can find them, but they're going to probably be expensive. So that harpsichord has not been used in many, many years. If you'll look up, you see these metal rods that run across the church, 3 of them. And I forgot to mention while we were downtown to get you to look at some of the buildings down there. In 1874, a lady asked me earlier about tornadoes in Tuscumbia. In 1874, in the fall, not spring, but in the fall, that's the second most frequent tornado season in this part of the country, when the seasons are changing back and forth. There was a tornado that came through here on a Sunday afternoon in November. And of course, back then, you just say, hey, it's looking stormy. And then the next thing you know, it's here, No warnings of any kind. And it came through town and did a lot of damage. Number of people were killed. One being Mrs. Winston up at the Winston home. She had gone up to the top of she saw a storm coming, and she decided she'd go up to the top of the roof area where they had an overlook and get a better view of what was happening. Well, when she realized the enormity of it, she started trying to come back down the stairs. And it's a spiral. Those of you who've been up there, it's a spiral staircase. And it hit about that time, and the stairway collapsed with her, and she was killed. But there were a number of people killed in that tornado. A lot of damage. And as a result, a number of buildings had slight movement in the walls and so forth. And that's what had happened here. So the remedy was to put these metal rods, they're fastened on the outside with big metal braces, and to run those through here. You notice they have the turnbuckle things on them where they could be tightened and everything. Run those through to shore up and tighten and reinforce the walls. And the only thing I can say about that is apparently that was a pretty good remedy, because that was in 1874 and this is 2025. So, but when you go back downtown, if you think about it, a number of the buildings down there in that area where we were standing and talking about the railroad, and if you look up, sometimes they're not all that high, sometimes they're up more near the top, but there'll be metal things. Some of them are circular, some of them are the cross type thing. Some of them look like a little medallion, but that's what all that is. That's where they've had the same thing done to the walls of those structures. As I said, Tuscumbia had a number of prominent citizens that were members of this church. We've already talked about the Winstons and the Lindsays. Now, another thing about Governor Lindsay, his daughter was Maud Lindsay. If you're familiar with Maud Lindsay, she had the first public kindergarten in Alabama and was the author of numerous children's books. Her home is over in Sheffield. But anyway, she was one of Governor Lindsay's daughters. So we mentioned the Steeles and the Winstons and the Lindsays and so forth. Also, the Deshler family, not Mr. Deshler. I think David Deshler was Baptist, from what I understand, but Mrs. Deshler and the 3 children were Presbyterian and went to church here. That's a very tragic family. The daughter died at a very young age with some type of, I don't know, it had been like scarlet fever or what, but something along that line. She died, I think, when she was in her teens. the two sons, the oldest son had obtained an appointment to West Point, and while he was at West Point, he went with a group of people to go swimming in the Hudson River and drowned. The younger brother, who was James Deshler, who Deshler High School is named after, received an appointment to West Point. He was there in the 1850s during the period of time that Robert E. Lee was the superintendent of West Point. And he finished well in his class. Now, the classes back then were not anything like they are today, number-wise, but he was seventh in a class of about 47 or something like that. And there were other notable people. I'm not going to get into that. A number of them became famous during the Civil War that were in that class. Anyway, he finished, and his initial tour of duty was out west. And when the secession crisis came and Alabama seceded, he did what many of the Southerners did at that time that were in the military. They resigned and joined the Confederacy. He became a brigadier general. He was captured during the Vicksburg campaign over at a place called Arkansas Post, right there on the Mississippi River. General Sherman mentions him in his memoirs because Sherman was in command of the Union forces that took Arkansas Post. And he mentions in his memoirs meeting a young officer who would not have been a general at that time. I don't know, maybe a major or something, but and he had a conversation with him, and he said it became pretty obvious that the young man was not interested in having a lot to say to him. But he said, I was impressed with him. He seemed like a fine young man, and so on and so forth. And then he later concludes it by saying, unfortunately, he was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga. James Deshler was captured, imprisoned for a while as a prisoner of war. But what they did back then, after a certain point in time, they would have what they called exchanges. You exchange, that's like hostages, you exchange your prisoners for ours, And so they would, most of them wound up going right back where they had been before. James Deshler was promoted brigadier general, and during the Battle of Chickamauga, which was in September of 1863, not long after Vicksburg fell in July of 63. In September, during the Battle of Chickamauga, which is over there right outside of Chattanooga, he was killed. And at the end of the war, he was buried there on the site. At the end of the war, his dad, David Deshler, went over there with one of their servants, and I think there was another young man from Colbert County that the same thing had happened to. They went over there and got their remains and brought them back here. The Deshler plot is out there in the Oakwood Cemetery. But anyway, the Tuscumbia Female Institute or Female Academy had been burned right shortly after the war during the early stages of Reconstruction. And so David Deshler knew he was getting on up in years, and he offered to Tuscumbia, he said, I will give you the property to build a new female institute with the understanding that you will name it in honor or in memory of my son, James Deshler. And so the city fathers agreed to that. He did leave them what was at that time, the Deshler property where the Deshler family had lived down here, the whole block on Main Street. and the Dexter Female Institute was constructed there. And ironically, finished in 1874, right before the tornado came, and the tornado destroyed it. So it had to be rebuilt. And it was rebuilt, and the Dexter Female Institute operated till over into the early 1900s, because back at that time, you didn't have a lot of co-ed education. You had male academies and female academies and so forth. But there wasn't a lot of co-ed with regard to, and of course those were all private institutions. But by the time you started getting into the 1900s, you're beginning to have more public education and more co-ed education. In, I guess about the time, or shortly after World War I ended, the Female Institute was torn down, and what became the first Dexter High School was built on that spot. 1924 was when it opened its doors, the 24-25 school year, first year for Dexter High School. Prior to that, there had been a high school, but it was just Tuscumbia High School. I have a good friend that his dad used to coach Howard Chapel, that the stadium is named for. He had an old photograph of Dexter's first football team taken in front of the school, sitting on the steps when everything was brand new, and the guy in the center is holding the football like that, and it says 24 on it, 1924. So I was able to obtain a copy of that from him. I thought that was neat. But that's the Dexter story. I had someone recently that said, how did the school become Dexter? And ironically, the Dexter family were all from Pennsylvania. They were not from around here. The dad, as I told you earlier, I think came here and was involved in the development of the railroad. But they came here from Pennsylvania. I'm trying to think if there's something else. There's always something I think of after it's all over with. I forgot. Of course, Helen Keller's family was here. She was baptized as an infant here, and I don't know that she ever actually joined the church, because as y'all all know her story, Ann Sullivan came here from up around Boston, worked with her for a while, and then she went back up east with Ann and never lived down here anymore. So I don't necessarily subscribe to the fact that she was a member of the church. She was here during her early childhood, but once she left, she came back here on a few occasions, special occasions. One having been when the Keller birthplace, Keller home, was, the city agreed to take over property and keep it maintained and everything. That was in the early to mid-50s. And I can remember listening on the radio. There was a big crowd down there, and a friend and I listened to it on the radio. And she was very difficult to understand when she spoke, because, she was both deaf and blind, and like I said, hard to understand her, but she was I think we'd all agree she was a remarkable woman. And she became an early advocate for the handicapped folks and all that kind of thing. And I've forgotten how many presidents she met. She met Alexander Graham Bell. Let me just mention the organ up here. As I said, the only thing that was here originally was a little pump organ down in this corner. The original organ was probably, which didn't look anything like that, but the original pipe organ probably was put up on the balcony maybe as early as the 1920s, 30s, somewhere along in there. And then down through the years, it's been expanded and added on to. The last big addition, it's kind of like adding on to a house. Last big addition was in the late 1980s. There was a family here in the church that their estate left money to enlarge and upgrade the organ. I believe that was in about 1989. The oldest church, continually, you got to remember that during the Civil War, so many churches, their pastors either went in the military or became chaplains or whatever. And so they didn't have anybody to conduct services on a regular basis. That did not happen here. And one of the reasons it didn't happen, you know the story about Reverend Mitchell over in Florence at the Presbyterian church over there. During one of the times of Union occupation, there were several Union officers in attendance at the Presbyterian church in Florence, and Reverend Mitchell, who was their pastor, I guess you'd have to say he made the mistake of praying for Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy with those Union officers sitting there. They got up, walked up to the pulpit, put him under arrest, took him back out of the church, made him march from Florence over here to Tuscumbia, and put him on the train to one of the prison camps up north. I think it was in Illinois. But anyway, he stayed there for several months. They didn't leave him up there or anything, but made an example out of him. And then he was eventually released. But shortly after that happened, the same thing occurred here. And that was Reverend Sawtelle over here. You can see Reverend B.N. Sawtelle, pastor 1861 to 1872. So he was the pastor here during the Civil War. Well, the exact same thing happened here, probably during that same period of Union occupation. Union officers present in the service. So I guess he kind of thought, I better not do the same thing Reverend Mitchell did. So he didn't, and that there wasn't a problem, And I just always tell people that's probably one of the reasons that we had an uninterrupted period of worship in this church all these years, even during the Civil War.